In the year 1845 AD, an expedition consisting of 2 ships set out on a voyage to the frozen Canadian archipelago. The goal was to find a passage that would be a shortcut linking the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean via the North Pole. Canadian, but shortly after the start of the voyage, 5 members of the crew fell ill, and the expedition was forced to leave them on the island in Greenland. The mission then moved, consisting of 129 people. 129 people. No one would see that after that, and for more than a century, no one knew what the fate of the ships was, but in recent decades, we started to know what happened, and what happened to them turned out to be more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Welcome, let me tell you today about the Lost Franklin expedition. But before we begin, do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell so that you will be notified of the new story every week, and I want you to reach the video 200,000 likes before the episode. The next is your interest with me. At the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the door to exploration opened wide, especially with the advent of steam engines. For the first time in human history, the map of the world was almost complete. In the year 1845, explorers had covered almost all corners of the Earth, except for a small area that had yet to be discovered, a coastal strip. It is approximately 1,600 meters long in the Canadian Arctic, a place where many explorers devoted their entire lives to discovering the Northwest Passage. But this discovery will not come easily and will be a graveyard for a large number of British sailors. During this period, England and the Second Great Powers were trying to expand their influence in every place in the world, and of course, this expansion was by sea, but there was always a problem facing them. The Americas were creating a natural sea barrier, and since the Panama Canal did not yet exist, this meant that the ships had to take the long route around South America and then return again up into the Pacific Ocean or walk from the other side. In both cases, the road is long by all standards. If we found a shortcut, the journey from England to China would be much shorter. This would mean more trade and much higher profits. This made the discovery of a shortcut a very important goal for the Royal Navy. That is why, in the early 19th century, the Navy launched a large group of the expeditions were trying to chart this path, but none of them reached what they were looking for. In the middle of the 19th century, the Royal Navy decided to make a last attempt. An expedition would head west towards the Lancaster Strait and then head towards the south, a distance of about 1,670 kilometers. A very difficult journey, but what would succeed would be glory and glory. But I wonder to whom will this honor go? The Navy was not able to take the decision of Sir John Barrow, a senior official in the Navy who was in charge of preparing the expedition. He had reached the age of 822, and he himself was ending his journey with a great achievement like this. But who could lead an expedition with such difficulty? This was the first person who thought of it, the famous polar explorer, Sir William Edward Parry. Captain Parry was born in Wales in the year 1790 AD. He was their record holder in 1827 for the furthest point reached by an explorer in the north. During his service in the Navy, he conducted 4 different expeditions to the North Pole, but when Sir Barrow was offered to lead the expedition, he rejected the offer and responded. He was tired of the North Pole. The second choice that Sir Barrow had in mind was Sir James Clark Ross. Captain Ross was born in the year 1800 AD, and he was also a polar explorer like Captain Parry. Over the course of 50 years of service in the Royal Navy, he had 6 expeditions to the North Pole and 1 to the South Pole. But why? Sir Barrow was offered to lead the expedition. He rejected the offer, and his response was that he had not yet been able to marry. He promised his wife that he would never go out again on any dangerous expeditions to the North Pole. The third choice was a young leader named James Fides James. For a quick moment, while James was in Singapore, he met George Barrow, the son of Sir Barrow the Elder. It is not known exactly what happened there, But what happened was that James paid people money to take care of something that George had done. If she had known, she would have killed Sir Barrow's father. For this reason, Sir Barrow presented her with a favor, and it helped him quickly rise to prominent positions in the Navy, to the point that he reached the rank of captain. A ship when he was only 29 years old, and despite the clear mediation from Sir Barrow to James, the Navy refused to let him be the leader of the mission, and their argument was that he did not have sufficient experience. The next choice was Captain Francis Kruger. Kruger was born into a simple family in Ireland in the year 1796, and he was a close friend of the captain. Ross and Captain Shue. Kruger, like the one before him, was an Arctic explorer. Over the course of 38 years of service in the Navy, held 6 expeditions to the North and South Pole. Kruger was very suitable to lead this expedition, but there was one obstacle that made the Navy refuse to choose Kruger. He was Irish and came from a simple family, not from the aristocratic class. The British did not want the man who would draw the last point on the world map and open the most important sea passage and obtain this honor to be Irish, and that is why they decided to make him assistant commander. But who would be the commander? The 5th choice was Sir John Franklin. Captain Franklin at that time was 59 years old and had been serving in the Navy for a short time. He was 45 years old. He was born in the year 17,686 to a well-off family. He was the only one of his sisters who served in the Navy and continued to rise through the ranks year after year while participating in many battles, the most famous of which were, for example, the French Revolutionary War and the Napoleonic War. Most of those who died of hunger, and those who survived lived because they ate the leather of the boots. Because of this, Franklin became famous as the man who ate his boot. Despite this, Franklin was known among his men as a religious and kind man who cared for them. This expedition was a golden opportunity for Franklin to correct the mistakes of the past, and accordingly, he agreed to the offer. The search for a leader for the expedition ended, and the Royal Navy finally settled. Sir John Franklin was appointed commander of the expedition, and Francis Kruger was to become the second commander, the one who led HMS Terror, and finally, James Fitz-Seamus was to become the third commander, the one who commanded HMS Erebus. These ships they chose for the expedition were the best ships for the mission. The flagship, HMS Erebus, was a battleship from the Heckler class, was modified specifically for Arctic expeditions, and was built in 1826. It was 32 meters long and 2 meters wide and had a crew of 67 sailors. As for the second ship, HMS Terror, it was a little older than it. It was built in 1813 as a combat ship of the Vives class. Its size and armament were every similar to the ship Arabs. The choice of these 2 ships in particular is because the combat ships are equipped to fire heavy mortars, and therefore their hulls are stronger than those of ordinary ships, which allows them to withstand sailing in the middle of the ice in the Arctic better. In addition, these ships were equipped with the latest technology available at that time. They were the first ships in the Royal Navy to be powered by steam engines. They were equipped with a 25-horsepower steam engine that was capable of propelling the ship at a speed of 4 knots, or 8 kilometers per hour. In addition to this, the copper propellers connected to the engine were designed so that they could disintegrate and break inside the hull of the ship, so they could protect them. The fan was made of ice if necessary, and the steam pipes that were connected to the engine were distributed throughout the ship so that they could be used at the same time as a central heating system. These engines needed about a ton of fresh water per hour, and accordingly, we needed a second piece of equipment to be present on the ship, which is seawater desalination equipment, including we provide water farms for the steam engine, and from them we provide water farms from which the ship's crew can drink as they want. As for the ship's body itself, it was reinforced with iron plates installed on the front and in the middle, and twice as thick as the ship's hull itself. You can say that the ships were like space shuttles. as for that era, they had the most intuitive and best technology available at the time. On May 19, 1845, the expedition set off on its long journey with 134 people on board, carrying supplies sufficient for all members of the trip for 3 full years. 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of alcoholic beverages, and a library containing 1,200 books, and the most important thing it provided. They had modern technology. The canned food was 16,000 cans of preserved food. For the first time, all the food that the sailors would have was canned food. These provisions would last for 3 full years and could also last for 5 years if they reduced the rations for each person. The expedition moved from London northward to Scotland and then crossed the Atlantic Ocean. As far as the Whaling Islands and the western coast of Greenland, but before the expedition reached Greenland, 5 members of the crew were infected with the disease. They were visible and could not complete the journey. Accordingly, they were released, and these 5 were the ones who actually escaped in the few days that they spent on the island. The crew members wrote the last letters. To their families in England, and in general, the whole crew was excited. They were about to embark on the most important journey they had ever undertaken in their lives. Component placement: a journey that would leave their name in history. Truth be told, it actually immortalized their name in history, but not for the reason they thought. On July 12, 1845, the expedition set off with 129 people on board, and then 2 weeks later, he saw a group of whalers in Baffin Bay, and that was the last time anyone saw the expedition ships or men that had to sail in the Arctic. It is slower than anywhere else in the world. Even in the summer, the canals and waterways remain full of ice, and the ships need to prefer to move on to heavy blocks of ice. The ice is out of its way as long as it is walking, and this must happen very slowly. If the ship was moving quickly while it was doing this, it would be very easy for these blocks to break the bow of the ship, and the whole ship would sink with time. Because of this slowness, the expedition in the first year covered about 800 meters only going around Cornwall Island, but they did not find the passage in this place, and in the end, they returned to Beechey Island with the onset of winter, meaning it Isenly about 350 kilometers away from Baffin Bay, the point from which they originally started. However, they considered that the first year was a good achievement. Thus, we knew that the area above had no passages. Because the winter in the Arctic freezes all the water in the sea, they took shelter in a small bay between Beechey Island and Daffa Island. When the water froze, the ship's crew lowered the sails and covered the entire ship from above with a cloth blanket, and the walls and sides of the ship were covered with ice in order to insulate it. In this way, they were able to create a somewhat warm atmosphere in which to spend the season. Winter was coming, and the snow was melting, and they continued their journey. Morale was very high during that winter. They had come a good way before the water froze. They had a lot of food and drink, and nothing to carry. In the first winter of 1845 to 1846, 3 crew members died and were buried on Beechey Island and were found. On their bodies in the 1980s, they were amazingly preserved for more than a century due to ice. When the bodies were examined, it became clear that the cause of death was infection with tuberculosis or dengue, but that is not the only reason. There is also an important reason, which we will learn a little more about, and the 5 men who were tired and cursed us. Remember them. It turns out that they were also those infected with tuberculosis, meaning tuberculosis was already widespread among the members of the expedition from the beginning, and tuberculosis at this stage was a deadly disease because the vaccines that are currently used had not yet been discovered. With the melting of the ice in the spring, the ships were freed from the ice, and the expedition began to continue its journey south towards the island that had been known at the time as King William's Land. It was an area of land on the edge of the areas discovered at the time, and they did not know at the time that it was an island. When they reached the crossroads at William Franklin Strait, he had 2 options: heading towards the south in the hope that it would actually be an island and staying in a place below which they could cross. Or they headed towards the west in the hope that they would cross the strait before winter, and because Franklin did not want to risk that they would go down to the south and find the road blocked, so he would have to go out again to the north and then start their way to the west. So he decided to go west along a friendly path. The biggest mistake he made was the area they entered to the west of King William Island. The most dangerous water in the entire area is an area of water in which there is a channel that is overflowing at the same time and ice is collecting in it in huge quantities, and before they reach it, they adjust their route and get out of the predicament. This water became stuck due to the large amount of ice, and the ships frozen near the west coast of King William Island, and there they spent the second winter of 1846 to 47. What they did not know was that this winter would be the beginning of the real cruelty of their luck. The winter of 1846 and the years that followed were some of the coldest years ever seen in the North Pole. Shockingly, the ice around King William Island had not set in during the summer at this time in January 1847. Lady Franklin, Sir Franklin's wife, was starting to worry that the mission was expected to last 1 year, and we had 2 full years left. So the Navy went and began to demand that they embark on a search and rescue campaign in order to search and search, but the Navy saw that there was no problem. It is normal for a mission with an expected duration of 1 year to last for 2 years, and the evidence is that the mission was already prepared for 3 years. But Lady Franklin wasn't convinced by these words and launched a massive media campaign in which she used all her knowledge to put pressure on the Navy. Although the Navy did not know at that time, the mission was really in need of rescue. The second reason that we said we would talk about as well. A little about the food. The canned food they had with them on the trip was not well packed. The company that was responsible for the packaging had been packing 16,000 cans in just 7 weeks, and the technology at the time did not allow this. However, they won the tender because they offered a low price for the cans and were able to offer them. This price is because the canned goods were low quality, and the lead solder used to seal the cans leaked into the food and contaminated the entire food with lead. However, some of the canned goods were not cooked well, and although the crew at this stage did not know, the food was causing food poisoning for many. Crew members and bad luck did not stop here. The pipes used in the water desalination system were also lined with lead, and when the lead was exposed to water from the sea, it began to corrode and precipitate into the water that they were drinking from, which supplied them mud. However, sailors for hundreds of years were using lemon juice bottles to fight disease. Ascaro, which is a disease that was very famous among sailors due to vitamin C deficiency because they lived at sea for months and sometimes years away from fruits and vegetables. But this time, because of the technology that made them smart, they did not scratch with them as much lemon juice as usual. They took with them canned vegetables and fruits and said that we would not needlemon juice. With the market for packing vegetables and fruits, they lost their effectiveness over time. The sailors did not feel that they wanted it in the first year, or perhaps the second year as well, but we have already entered the 3rd year. On May 28, 1847, the expedition decided to send a team on sledges to the beach on King William Island, and there they left 2 letters in 2 piles of the quarantine is so that the people who come after them will receive the letters. The letters were simple and direct. They included their itinerary so far, the location of the ships, that Captain Franklin was still the commander, and that everything was fine, but after a while, after these letters, nothing would be fine. It is clear that they were thinking that the snow would be over. They would begin to complete their voyage, but in the year 1847 to 1480, the snow had not broken, nor in June, nor July, nor even August, and the ships remained confined throughout this period, and in the long winter that never ended, the ship Terror began to sink into the solid ice, and most of its crew moved to the ship Arabs with the rest of their colleagues till they warmed each other and rationed the consumption of the food that remained with them. As for the ship Terror, they began to use it as air refrigerator for the additional equipment they had with them and for the bodies that began to increase day after day. On June 11, 1847, Captain John Franklin finally died. In the winter of 1847 to 1848, the Navy began to move. The media campaign was in operation for a year. They accused the Navy of inaction, and that is why they had to do something. At the beginning of 1848, a search and rescue campaign was launched, and they entered the region from both sides, the Atlantic Ocean side and the Pacific Ocean side. James Ross, one of the candidates who refused to lead the Bath Party, went out in the search campaign because he was still a new groom. But this time, he went out on a search expedition in an attempt to rescue Francis Kruger, his close friend, on April 22, 1848. After 18 full months of being locked in place, unable to move, Captain Kruger, who took command after the death of Captain Franklin, decided to abandon ships and try his luck on land instead of preferring to sit on the ship. They died one after the other, and 14 crew members put small boats on skis and put all their needs on them and began their journeys south to King William Island. The plan was to reach the Back River, 240 meters away. When they got there, they would take the boats they had and go to the nearest commercial station, and on April 25th. They reached the stone vaults where they had left the messages and amended the messages, and they remained as follows. In them, they wrote, "The ship Terror and the ship Erebus were abandoned on April 22nd, 30 meters northwest of this point, after they were besieged by the Skin from September 12, 1846 until now, and the crew now consists of 105 people. Under the command of Captain Kruger, and the total number of deaths so far is Captain Franklin, 9 officers, and 15 individuals, signed by James Fitz Sheems, Captain of the Arps." The overland journey began, and the men began pulling sleds weighing more than 3 tons, a little on the ice and a little on the rocks, at freezing temperatures. The situation was as bad as it could be for all the men. They suffered from general weakness due to malnutrition and lead poisoning, and many of them were dying slowly due to the script. Throughout the trip that they were planning every time, one